did the US military really plan to nuke the moon? It sounds like something from a movie, doesn't it? A wild, almost unbelievable idea, but believe it or not, the answer is yes. They really did. Not just a fleeting thought, but an actual classified project with a code name and real scientists working on it. It's a story that tells us a lot about a very tense time in history. So, let's go back in time a bit. The late 1950s. This was a crazy period. The world was split in two, basically. On one side, the United States and its friends. On the other, the Soviet Union and its allies. This was the Cold War. It wasn't a hot war with armies clashing directly, but it was a constant simmering conflict. A war of ideologies, of technology, of who could scare who more. And the biggest fear for everyone was nuclear war. Both sides had nukes. Lots of them. And everyone knew if those things started flying, it would be really, really bad. In this atmosphere, anything seemed possible. There was a huge push for technological superiority, especially in space. On October 4th, 1957, something happened that really shook the United States. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik. It was the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. Just a metal ball beeping away, but it was a huge deal. It meant the Soviets had powerful rockets. Rockets that could potentially carry bombs. It felt like a punch to the gut for America. People were scared. They felt like they were falling behind. The space race began right there. It wasn't just about science or exploration anymore. It was about national pride. It was about showing who was stronger, who was smarter, who could do more amazing things. And in this intense competition, people started thinking way outside the box. They started looking at all sorts of extreme measures. Things that, looking back, might seem a bit, desperate. The moon, for example. It was up there. Big and bright. Everyone could see it. What if you could do something on the moon that would send a clear message? A message that everyone on Earth would see. That's where the idea of nuking the moon came in. It wasn't just a random thought someone had in a bar. It grew out of this very specific, very scary context of the Cold War and the space race. It was about showing force. It was about saying, we can do this, don't mess with us. The project even had a code name. Project A119. It sounds very official, doesn't it? As it was a serious proposal. The main goal wasn't really scientific in the way we think about science today. It had a scientific component, sure, but the big driver was military and psychological. It was about prestige, it was about fear, it was about propaganda. If America could detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon and everyone on Earth could see it, what would that tell the Soviets? It would tell them that America had the rocket power to reach the moon and the nuclear capability to make a huge impact. It would be a huge show of technological might, a clear sign of who was ahead in the space race, or at least who could make the biggest, most visible statement. So this wasn't just a hypothetical discussion, it was a real plan put on paper by real people. It came from a place of deep anxiety and a desire to regain the upper hand in a global competition that felt like it had the highest stakes imaginable. The idea of using a nuclear bomb, even if it was on the moon and not on Earth, shows just how far people were willing to go. How desperate the times felt. It was a time when the moon, instead of being a symbol of peace and exploration, almost became a billboard for a superpower's might. That's the kind of thinking that was happening back then. It was a very different world. And the moon, sitting up there, became a target for a very unusual kind of demonstration. The need to respond to Sputnik, to show American strength, drove a lot of crazy ideas. And this was definitely one of them, a very big, very visible, very nuclear idea. It shows that sometimes, in times of crisis, the human mind can come up with some truly astonishing and frightening proposals. This was one of those. And it was all about who could dominate space, and by extension, who could dominate the world. Okay, so they had this idea, but who actually worked on it? It wasn't just some vague concept. Project A119 was a real thing, a classified study, and it involved some smart people. One key person was a physicist named Leonard Rifle. He worked for the Armor Research Foundation, which was connected to the U.S. Air Force. He was in charge of the project. And get this, one of the younger members of his team, a very bright astronomer, was none other than Carl Sagan. Yes, that Carl Sagan, who later became famous for explaining the universe to everyone in such an amazing way. He was just starting his career then, and he was involved in predicting how a dust cloud from a lunar explosion might behave. The official name for the project was A Study of Lunar Research Flights. That sounds pretty harmless, doesn't it? Just some research flights, but the research they were talking about involved detonating a nuclear weapon. The primary goal wasn't just, hey, let's blow something up on the moon for fun. It had a specific purpose, as I said before. It was about showing force. It was about propaganda. The US wanted to prove its superiority in space and missile technology. They wanted to deliver a message to the Soviet Union. And they wanted that message to be unmistakable. So, how would they do this? They planned to use a small nuclear bomb. Not a huge, city destroying bomb, but something like a W-25 warhead. This was a relatively small, lightweight bomb designed to be carried by missiles. It still packed a punch, though, about 1.7 kilotons, roughly a fifth of the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But the idea wasn't to destroy the moon. It was to make a visible flash, a very bright, very distinct flash that people could see from Earth with their naked eyes. Imagine looking up at the moon and suddenly seeing a bright explosion. That would certainly get people's attention, wouldn't it? The plan was to launch this bomb on a rocket. The rocket would need to be powerful enough to reach the moon. And it would need to be accurate enough to hit the right spot. They aimed for the dark side of the moon, near the Terminator line, which is the line where day meets night. Why there? Because the explosion would happen against the dark background, making the flash even more dramatic and visible. The idea was to create a mushroom cloud, similar to what happens on Earth, but with lunar dust. This cloud would then be illuminated by the sun, making it even more visible to telescopes, and possibly even the naked eye from Earth. The scientific part, which was a secondary benefit, involved studying the moon's composition. If you blow a hole in the moon, you expose the material underneath. Scientists could then analyze the dust and debris. This could tell them about the moon's geology, its interior, and so on. Also, they could study the seismic activity. The moon has moonquakes, but a nuclear explosion would be a huge man-made moonquake. Studying the shockwaves could give them data about the moon's internal structure. So yes, there were some scientific justifications thrown in there. But let's be real, those were probably not the main reason. The main reason was the show, the spectacle, the big, bold statement. The project looked into a lot of details, like how big the flash would be, how long it would last, and what kind of dust cloud it would create. Carl Sagan's job involved calculating how much ice could be on the moon and how the dust would spread. His calculations were pretty important for figuring out if the explosion would be visible. They were trying to ensure that this huge effort would actually achieve its main goal to be seen by everyone. From a distance of almost 240,000 miles, making a small explosion visible is no easy feat. That's why they considered a nuclear bomb. A conventional bomb wouldn't be powerful enough to create such a show. A nuclear explosion was the only way they thought they could achieve the desired effect. So it wasn't just a fantasy, it was a well thought out, albeit controversial plan. It was serious enough that real scientists spent real time on the government's dime figuring out the mechanics of how to nuke the moon. They looked at everything from the type of bomb, to the rocket, to the exact location on the moon, to what people on Earth would actually see. All of it driven by the Cold War and the intense desire to show the world that America was a powerful player, especially in the new frontier of space. It sounds wild, but it was a very calculated, strategic move in a very high-stakes game. So, why would anyone even seriously consider nuking the moon? It sounds so drastic, so over the top. But when you look at the geopolitical situation of the time, it starts to make a weird kind of sense. The 1950s and 60s were all about the US versus the USSR, the Cold War, remember? This wasn't just a rivalry, it was a global struggle for influence and power, and the space race was a huge part of that. It was a proxy war, fought not with bullets, but with rockets and satellites. The biggest motivation was propaganda value. After Sputnik, the US felt like it was behind. The Soviets had pulled off this amazing feat, sending a satellite into space. It looked like they were winning. The US needed a dramatic response, something that would capture the world's attention, something that would scream, America is powerful, we are technologically advanced. What could be more attention-grabbing than a nuclear explosion on the moon? Everyone on Earth would see it. It would be a stark, visible demonstration of American might. It would be a massive psychological win, or so they thought. Imagine the headlines, the conversations. It would dominate the news cycle, showing off US rocketry and nuclear capabilities. It would project an image of undeniable power. Another strong motivator was deterrence. The idea was to send a clear message to the Soviets. Without engaging in direct conflict on Earth, the US could show how capable it was. If America could send a nuclear bomb to the moon, what else could it send? This kind of demonstration could act as a deterrent, making the Soviets think twice about any aggressive moves. It was a way of saying, we have the technology, we have the will, Don't underestimate us. In the Cold War, showing strength was a key part of keeping the peace, paradoxically. The belief was that if one side looked too weak, the other might try to take advantage. So, Project A119 was, in a twisted way, seen as a way to maintain that fragile balance of power. And then there was the fear of what the Soviets might do. What if they did something similar? What if the Soviets were planning their own lunar explosion? Or even worse, what if they were planning to put military bases on the moon? Or use the moon as a launch pad for missiles? These were real fears, even if they seem outlandish now. The moon was seen as the ultimate high ground. If you controlled the moon, you might have a strategic advantage. So, there was a sense of urgency to explore military applications for the moon, even if that meant a nuclear demonstration. The idea was to get there first, or at least show that the US could operate there effectively before the Soviets established a foothold. The scientific curiosity, as I mentioned, was also a justification, but it was secondary. They claimed it would provide valuable data about the moon's geology and seismic activity. Blowing a hole in the moon could expose the subsurface material, letting scientists study its composition. Measuring the shock waves could tell them about the moon's interior, so they could always point to these scientific benefits as a reason, even if the real reason was more about politics and power. It was a good way to justify a potentially controversial act. It made the project seem more legitimate, less purely aggressive. Think about it from their perspective. It was a race. A race to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. A race to dominate space. A race for global influence. In this context, the moon became another arena for competition. A visible, undeniable spectacle on the moon would be a propaganda coup. It would show the world that the US was not just catching up, but perhaps surpassing the Soviets in this crucial new domain. It was about pride, power, and the terrifying logic of the Cold War. The idea was to leave an indelible mark, literally, on the face of the moon, visible to all, as a testament to American technological prowess. It was a gamble, a big one, but the motivations for such a risky play were very real and deeply rooted in the political climate at the time. They wanted to make a statement loud and clear across the vast emptiness of space, right to the heart of the Soviet Union. So, Project A119 was a real plan, with real motivations. But it never happened. Why not? Well, there were a lot of problems. Serious problems. Enough problems that even in the feverish atmosphere of the Cold War, people realized it was probably a terrible idea. First, the technical challenges were huge. Getting a rocket to the moon in the late 1950s was incredibly difficult. The success rate for lunar missions back then was very low. What if the rocket failed? What if it blew up on the launch pad? That would be an even bigger public relations disaster than not doing anything at all. It would show weakness, not strength, and what if it missed the moon? Imagine a nuclear bomb just floating around in space or crashing back to Earth. The thought alone was terrifying. Accuracy was a big issue. Even if it reached the moon, hitting the exact spot to make the explosion visible was a huge challenge. They wanted it to be seen from Earth, remember? So, precision was key. Then there were the ethical concerns. This was a big one. Even back then, people understood that detonating a nuclear bomb on the moon might not be a great idea for the long term. What if it contaminated the moon? The moon was seen as a pristine, untouched environment. Scientists were already dreaming of exploring it, studying it. Nuclear fallout on the moon would ruin that. It would contaminate samples, make future exploration dangerous, and just generally make a mess of things. It would be an act of vandalism on a cosmic scale. There was also the question of ownership. Who owns the moon? Can one country just go up there and blow something up? It raised a lot of international law questions, even before such laws really existed for space. And speaking of public relations, that was another massive headache. How would the world react? While the US government might have seen it as a show of strength, many people around the world would probably see it as reckless, dangerous, and provocative. It could easily backfire, making the US look like a warmongering nation, willing to deface a celestial body just to prove a point. It could alienate allies and fuel anti-American sentiment. The potential for a global outcry was huge. It could be seen as an act of cosmic arrogance, not technological brilliance. Scientists, even those not directly involved in the project, started to raise objections. They were concerned about contaminating the moon. They saw the moon as a unique laboratory, a place to learn about the history of the solar system. Blowing it up with a nuclear bomb would destroy that opportunity. It would contaminate a place they desperately wanted to study. The scientific community broadly wasn't on board with this kind of experiment. They felt it would sacrifice invaluable scientific potential for a temporary political statement. Safety was another huge factor. What if the rocket carrying the nuclear warhead had a catastrophic failure during launch or ascent? A nuclear bomb detonating over Florida, for example, would be an unimaginable disaster. The risks involved in launching such a device were immense, and the consequences of a failure were too dire to ignore. The technology for safe and reliable rocket launches was still very primitive compared to today. And finally, there was the cost. Developing the rocket, building the bomb, running the tests, all of it would be incredibly expensive. Was the propaganda value really worth all these downsides? The immense financial cost, the massive technical risk, the ethical backlash, the potential for public outrage, the scientific objections, and the sheer danger of it all. As time went on, and people thought more deeply about it, the balance started to tip heavily against the project. The short-term political gain seemed less and less worth the long-term, possibly irreversible damage and risks. So, in the end, the project was quietly scrapped. It was never officially announced that it was canceled, because it was never officially announced that it existed in the first place. The realization settled in that this was probably a bad idea overall. The risks far outweighed any potential benefits. The world didn't need a nuclear flash on the moon to understand the power of the US. There were other, less destructive ways to compete in the space race. The idea faded away, becoming just another strange, dark secret from the Cold War era. It was a project born of fear and competition, but ultimately abandoned due to common sense and the sheer scale of the potential negative consequences. So, if Project A119 was such a big, secret plan, how did we even find out about it? It wasn't something the US government proudly announced. It stayed classified for a long time. The story slowly came out over the years, mostly through leaks and then through the statements of the people who were involved. Leonard Reifel, the physicist who led the project, started talking about it decades later. In 2000, he confirmed the details of the plan. He had kept it secret for a long time, but eventually felt it was important for people to know. Carl Sagan's involvement also played a role. His private papers, donated to the Library of Congress after his death, contained documents related to Project A119. These documents provided more evidence and details about his work on the project. While Sagan himself didn't publicly discuss his involvement much during his lifetime, his papers helped confirm the story. It showed that he was a young, ambitious scientist working on whatever projects were put in front of him, even if they were controversial. He later became a huge advocate for peaceful space exploration and an opponent of nuclear weapons, so his early involvement in a plan like this is quite ironic. When the story became public, many people were shocked. It sounded so extreme, so out of character for what we usually think of as space exploration. But it really highlights the mindset of the Cold War. Today we look at it with a mix of disbelief and a sense of relief that it never happened. It's often seen as one of the craziest ideas from a very crazy time. It shows the lengths to which nations would go, the kind of desperate measures they'd consider, in an era of such intense tension and fear. The failure of Project A119 also had a positive legacy in an unexpected way. The ethical concerns and international reactions that were anticipated helped shape how we think about space today. In 1967, the Outer Space Treaty was signed. This treaty, developed by the United Nations, basically says that no country can claim the moon or other celestial bodies. It also prohibits placing weapons of mass destruction in space or on celestial bodies. While Project A119 was scrapped before the treaty, the underlying concerns about militarizing space certainly contributed to the need for such international agreements. It was a recognition that space should be a place for peaceful exploration and scientific discovery, not for military posturing or nuclear demonstrations. Today, the moon is seen as a scientific marvel, a place for international cooperation and exploration. Countries are planning missions to the moon, building bases, and learning more about our cosmic neighbor. The idea of nuking it seems almost unthinkable now, a relic of a bygone era. It serves as a reminder of how much our perspective on space has changed. We've moved from seeing it as a battleground to seeing it as a shared frontier for humanity. The broader lesson from Project A119 is how easily fear and competition can lead to extreme ideas. In times of crisis, the lines between what's rational and what's reckless can become very blurry. It reminds us that even highly intelligent people, under immense pressure, can propose things that, in hindsight, seem absolutely bonkers. But it also shows that good sense can prevail, that eventually the risks and the ethical considerations can outweigh the perceived benefits, even in the most intense geopolitical climate. So, did the US military really plan to nuke the moon? Yes, they absolutely did. It was a secret project born out of the Cold War space race, meant to be a show of force. But thankfully, for the sake of the moon and for humanity's future in space, it was never carried out. It remains a fascinating, slightly unsettling footnote in history, a testament to the strange and sometimes terrifying ideas that can emerge when nations are locked in a desperate struggle for dominance. It's a story that still has power, reminding us of the importance of considering the consequences of our actions, even in the furthest reaches of space.